The streets of Morehead, Kentucky were a slaughterhouse. For 2 terrifying hours, the town echoed with the roar of Winchesters as over 100 armed men laid siege to a hotel. When the Gunsmoke finally cleared, the most powerful man in the county, Craig Tolliver, lay dead in the dirt, his body riddled with bullets. The newspapers called it the end of a brutal feud. But what if it wasn't a feud at all? What if it was the final bloody battle of a war fought over politics, power, and the very soul of a county? Today, we separate the folklore from the facts and uncover the story of the Rowan County War. Before the gunfire and the blood, Rowan County was a world of 2 halves, held together by a fragile peace. Out in the hollows and on the ridges, life moved to the rhythm of the seasons. Men like Floyd Martin woke with the sun and knew their land not by deeds and property lines, but by the feel of the soil in their hands. They were farmers, patriarchs of large families, their wealth measured in livestock, healthy children, and the respect of their neighbors. Their world was one of hard work, self-reliance, and a fierce independence born from the isolation of the mountains. To them, the law wasn't written in a book down at the courthouse. It was a code of honor passed down through generations. Then there was the town of Morehead. It was the county's beating heart, and its pulse was controlled by one man, Craig Tolliver. His kingdom wasn't made of dirt and timber, but of influence and fear. From the bar of his Monarch saloon or a suite in his Galt House hotel, he orchestrated the county's politics. He was handsome, always dressed in fine clothes that stood out against the town's mud and dust, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. He was the democratic boss, the man who could make another man rich with a handshake or ruin him with a whisper. He saw Morehead not as a home, but as a chessboard, and every person in it was a pawn. These 2 worlds brushed against each other on market days. The Martin clan and their Republican allies would ride into town, their faces weathered by the sun, their conversations quiet and watchful. They'd trade their crops, buy supplies, and endure the smirks of Tolliver's men who ran the town. In the saloons, Democrats and Republicans drank at separate tables, the air thick with an unspoken history. Everyone knew who had worn the blue and who had worn the gray, or whose father had. It was a peace, but it was the kind of quiet you get in the woods just before a storm breaks. Every handshake was a calculation. Every glance held a question. The people of Rowan County were living on a fault line, a deep crack in the earth left by the Civil War, and everyone could feel the ground trembling beneath their feet. They were proud people, both in the town and in the hills, and pride in Appalachia is a dangerous thing. It can build a home, but it can also burn one to the ground with everyone still inside it. And on the horizon, an election was coming. It was August of 1884. To the rest of America, it was just another local vote. But in Rowan County, it wasn't about choosing a representative. It was a referendum on power itself. It was the spark falling toward a powder keg that had been filling for 20 years. Little did they know, this day of voting would not be settled with ballots, but with blood, and the world they knew was about to be lost forever in a haze of gunsmoke. The hatred that fueled the Rowan County War wasn't born in a saloon brawl in 1884. Its seeds were sown 20 years earlier in the blood and fire of the Civil War. Kentucky was a state torn in half, a borderland where loyalties were not to a flag, but to family and to the ground beneath one's feet. Brother fought against brother, and neighbor took up arms against neighbor. When the war ended, the soldiers returned to their farms and towns, but they brought the conflict back with them. They laid down their rifles, but they never truly laid down the fight. In the rugged hills of Rowan County, these old battle lines hardened into political identities. To be a Republican, like the Martins, was to align with the Union, with the federal government that had preserved the nation. It was the party of Lincoln, a symbol of victory and order to some, but of occupation and overreach to others. To be a Democrat like Craig Tolliver and his faction, was to carry the banner of the old Confederacy, of states' rights and resistance to that same federal power. It was a politics of pride and grievance, a burning resentment that the world had been turned upside down. This wasn't about policy debates, it was about memory. It was about which side your father fought on at Perryville or Shiloh. It was about remembering the Union patrols or the Confederate raiders who had passed through these very hollows. The land itself held these memories. For the Martins and their allies, their farms were a testament to their own hard work and independence, a legacy carved from the wilderness. For Tolliver, the town of Morehead was a different kind of territory, a center of power to be controlled, its commerce and law to be bent to the will of his party, his faction, his cause. In these mountains, a family name is a heavy thing. It's a coat of arms and a burden, all at once. The name Martin became a rallying cry for every Republican farmer who felt choked by the town's political machine. It stood for the country, for the hills, for the men who answered to no one but God. And the name Tolliver became the symbol of absolute democratic control, of the saloons, the courthouse, and the money that made the town run. It was a feud of ideas long before it was a feud of men. The blood of the Civil War had never truly dried. It had just soaked into the soil, waiting for a single spark to turn the ground red once more. The conflict in Rowan County didn't live in grand declarations, but in the quiet, poisonous whispers that spread from house to house. Craig Tolliver's Monarch Saloon wasn't just a place to drink. It was a spider's parlor where the web of rumor was spun. Here, his lieutenants, men who owed him their jobs or their freedom, would gather. They were the town's deputies, clerks, and business owners, all bound to Tolliver by loyalty or fear. They nurtured every slight against their party, magnifying small disputes into grave insults against the Democratic cause and Tolliver himself. The Martin alliance was quieter, forged not over whiskey, but over shared meals and silent nods of understanding on the steps of a country church. Theirs was a sprawling network of kin and fellow Republicans, families like the Coopers and the Hoggers, who saw Tolliver's grip on the courthouse as a tyranny that was slowly strangling them. They were men who had been denied loans, lost court cases on technicalities, or had their businesses squeezed by Tolliver's allies. Their support for Floyd Martin wasn't just political, it was a matter of survival. The ground was already salted with old wounds. Just a few years prior, a sheriff's election had been decided by a handful of questionable ballots, installing a Tolliver man and leaving the Martins and their supporters feeling cheated and disenfranchised. There was the bitter memory of a land dispute between a Tolliver ally and a Republican farmer, a case settled in a court controlled by Tolliver's friends. These weren't isolated incidents, they were a pattern. Each one was a fresh layer of resentment, a reminder that the law in Rowan County bent to the will of the town boss. Gossip became a weapon, as dangerous as any pistol. A drunken argument at the general store was retold in the Monarch Saloon as a deliberate Republican provocation. A Martin supporter speaking too loudly about his rights was marked as a troublemaker. The air grew thick with suspicion. Men started carrying guns, not just for hunting, but for a trip into town. Friendships that had crossed party lines began to fray. The community wasn't just divided, it was curdling, turning sour with paranoia and hate. The stage was being set for a tragedy, and every rumor, every old grudge, was another nail being hammered into the coffin of peace. In the long, sweltering weeks leading up to the August election of 1884, a heavy stillness settled over Rowan County. The summer had been brutally hot and dry, cracking the creek beds and turning the dirt roads into a fine, choking powder that coated every leaf and fence post. Old-timers whispered that it was a bad sign when the katydids fell silent in the heat of the day. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the coming violence. The usual sounds of the mountains, the birds, the rustle of game in the undergrowth seemed to have faded, replaced by an oppressive quiet that felt more menacing than any storm. The true omen, however, wasn't in the sky or the trees. It was in the faces of the men gathering in Morehead. Election day was approaching, and it felt less like a civic duty and more like a muster for war. The flow of whiskey, always a tool of political persuasion in those days, began to run more freely than usual, loosening tongues and sharpening tempers. Craig Tolliver's men walked the town's boardwalks with a certain swagger, their hands resting near their hips, while the Martin men who rode in from the country were grim-faced and watchful, their eyes scanning every alley and doorway. A deep sense of dread, a cold knot in the gut, became a shared secret among the people of Rowan. Wives watched their husbands clean rifles that hadn't been fired since the last deer season, a silent question hanging in the air between them. Men who had been neighbors their whole lives now passed each other on the road with a curt nod, the old bonds of community straining under the weight of political hatred. This wasn't just another election. It felt like a final reckoning was at hand. They couldn't have known what was coming, not exactly, but they could feel the pressure building, a charge in the air that promised not rain, but lightning. Election day, August 4th, 1884, dawned hot and suffocating. At a polling place just outside Morehead, the air was thick with more than just summer humidity. It was charged with whiskey and years of bottled-up hatred. Men from both factions gathered, their political affiliations worn like uniforms. Votes were being bought with liquor, and every conversation was a low growl of intimidation or defiance. This wasn't democracy in action. It was a standoff, a test of nerve where everyone was waiting for the first man to flinch. The spark came in the form of a drunken slur. John Martin, Floyd Martin's own son, got into a heated argument with a fervent Tolliver supporter named Solomon Bradley. The exact words were swallowed by the noise and the heat, but they were likely the same insults that had been traded for years. Taunts about the war, about family, about honor. But this time, fueled by cheap whiskey and the tension of the day, words were not enough. Shouts turned to shoves, and shoves exploded into a vicious, desperate brawl. It was over in a flash of chaotic violence. The crowd surged, men yelled, but no one dared to intervene. In the midst of the scuffle, in the dust and the confusion, Solomon Bradley fell to the ground, mortally wounded. Whether a knife flashed in the sun, or if he was simply beaten to death, the accounts would forever conflict. But the result was brutally clear. Bradley lay dying, and John Martin stood over him, his knuckles raw, the grim reality of his actions beginning to dawn on his face. The cheering and the jeering died instantly, replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. The news ripped through the county faster than a telegram. For the Martin clan, it was a tragedy, but a defensible one. They called it a fair fight, a drunken brawl that went too far, provoked by Tolliver's men and their liquor. John Martin was arrested, and his family prepared for a legal battle. But for Craig Tolliver and his faction, this was no accident. This was a declaration of war. It was the son of their political enemy striking down one of their own on election day. They saw it as a calculated act of aggression, an assassination meant to send a message. The law might have had John Martin in a cell, but the code of the mountains now demanded a different kind of justice. The political quarrel had been baptized in blood. It was no longer about who would control the courthouse, it was about vengeance. The first drop of blood had hit the dry Kentucky dirt, and a war was about to bloom from it. There was no going back now. What followed was not an open war, but a slow, creeping plague of violence that lasted for 3 years. The law of the gun replaced the law of the land, and Rowan County became a place of shadows and fear. Death could come from anywhere, at any time. A man might be plowing his field, the only sound the harness creaking and the birds singing, when the tree line would suddenly erupt with a volley of gunfire. He would simply fall, another life erased without a word. A riderless horse returning to a barn at dusk became a common and dreaded sight, a silent messenger of another ambush. The first major act of retribution was aimed directly at the head of the Martin clan. As Floyd Martin rode along a quiet country road, a section of woods he'd passed 1,000 times before, the trees themselves seemed to explode. A hail of lead tore through the air, and Martin was thrown from his horse. He lay grievously wounded, but by some miracle, he survived. The message, however, had been delivered in smoke and lead. No one was safe, no place was sacred. The war of assassination had begun. This shadow war culminated on a blistering summer morning, June 22nd, 1887. The Martin faction, now an army of over 100 determined men, descended from the hills and laid siege to Morehead. The morning calm was shattered by a sound like rolling thunder, a sound that sent townspeople scrambling for their lives, diving into cellars or hiding behind anything that could stop a bullet. For hours, the air was filled with a constant, deafening roar as hundreds of rounds were fired. It was a storm of lead. The high-pitched whine of bullets was everywhere. Wooden storefronts splintered, sending shards of timber flying through the air. The windows of the Galt House Hotel, where Craig Tolliver and his men were cornered, shattered one by one. Through the thick haze of gunsmoke, you could see the muzzle flashes from doorways, from rooftops, from behind wagons. The Martin men weren't brawling. They were conducting a methodical extermination, tightening a noose of rifle fire around the heart of Tolliver's power. Then came the final, desperate act. Trapped, his men falling around him, Craig Tolliver made a run for it. He burst from the hotel, a flash of motion against the chaos. It wasn't a single shot that answered him, but a deafening, instantaneous chorus of rifles firing as one. The unstoppable town boss, the man who had ruled Rowan County with an iron fist, simply collapsed in the middle of the street. And in the moment his body hit the dirt, the thunder of the guns stopped. A deafening silence fell over Morehead, broken only by the ringing in men's ears and the sight of the dead man lying in the dust. The war was over. To understand the 3 years of terror that followed, we must try to look at the world through Craig Tolliver's cold, calculating eyes. In his own mind, he was no villain. He was a king, and Morehead was his kingdom. The Galt House Hotel was his castle, the Monarch Saloon his throne room. He believed in order, but it was his order. He provided jobs, settled disputes, and kept the peace, all so long as his authority was never questioned. He didn't see the Martins and their allies as a political opposition. He saw them as rebels, as a disease threatening the body of his carefully controlled world. When Solomon Bradley was killed on election day, Craig Tolliver didn't see a drunken brawl gone wrong. He saw an assassination. He saw the son of his chief rival striking down one of his loyalists in a blatant act of defiance. To him, this was an insurrection, a declaration of war against his rule. A king cannot allow such a challenge to go unanswered, or the throne itself will crumble. The moment he heard the news, a switch didn't flip from anger to rage. It flipped from political maneuvering to calculated extermination. The Martins had chosen the weapon, and he would simply prove he was a master of it. The decision to ambush Floyd Martin wasn't made in a fit of passion. It was a cold, strategic move, a piece being moved on a chessboard. Tolliver would have seen it as a regrettable but necessary act of statecraft. In his logic, removing the head of the rebellion would cause the movement to collapse. After the ambush failed, he wouldn't have felt frustration or panic, but a grim resolve. It was simply a problem that now required a more thorough solution. For 3 years, as the bodies fell on both sides, it's unlikely Tolliver felt guilt. Each report of another Martin supporter shot from ambush would have been received not with glee, but with a sense of grim satisfaction. It wasn't murder, it was management. It was the slow, methodical process of cutting a cancer out of his county. He was the only man, in his own view, strong enough to do what needed to be done. This is what makes his evil so chilling. It was not the product of madness, but of a terrible, unwavering certainty that he was the hero of his own story. When the final volley of shots faded, a silence fell over Morehead. It was a silence so deep and heavy it felt louder than the gunfire that had preceded it. A thick, acrid haze of gun smoke hung in the humid summer air, burning the eyes and throat. For a long moment, nothing moved. The only sign that the world hadn't ended was the sight of Craig Tolliver's lifeless body lying in the dusty street, a final stark punctuation mark at the end of a bloody 3-year sentence. Slowly, cautiously, the town began to emerge from its hiding places. Cellar doors creaked open. Shopkeepers peered out from behind barricaded windows. The faces of the townspeople were pale with shock, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. The main street looked like a battlefield. Bullet holes pocked nearly every building. Windows were shattered, and the ground was littered with spent shell casings. The bodies of Tolliver and his lieutenants lay where they had fallen, silent testament to the terrible finality of the fight. The Martin faction, victorious, did not flee back to their hollows. They were no longer an invading army. They were the new power in Rowan County. They stood in the open, rifles held loosely in their hands, their faces grim and streaked with sweat and gunpowder. They had come to Morehead to kill a king, and they had succeeded. With Tolliver and his closest men dead, their political machine, built on years of intimidation and control, had vanished in the space of a single morning. The reign was over, but news of a private war travels fast. When word reached the state capital of Frankfurt that a county seat had been seized by an armed force and its leadership exterminated in the streets, the reaction was one of pure shock. This wasn't a feud, this was an insurrection. Governor J. Proctor Knott didn't send a sheriff, he sent the army. For the first time in Kentucky's history, the state militia was called out to quell a local war. Days later, uniformed soldiers marched down the main street of Morehead, their polished boots kicking up the same dust that had soaked up Craig Tolliver's blood. They came with bayonets fixed, under orders to restore order by force if necessary. They were a foreign power, an outside authority that neither the Martins nor the Tollivers had ever answered to. Their arrival marked the true end of the war. The law of the mountains had finally been silenced by the law of the state. The arrival of the state militia did not bring peace to Rowan County. It simply put a lid on a boiling pot. The gunfire was replaced by a tense, suffocating quiet, enforced by the cold steel of soldiers' bayonets. But beneath this forced calm, the community was more fractured than ever. The war wasn't over. It had just moved indoors, into the whispers in the general store and the fearful glances exchanged over church pews. The town of Morehead and the surrounding hollows broke into two camps, with a terrified majority caught in the middle. For the Republicans and the families of the Martin faction, it was a moment of liberation. They saw themselves not as killers, but as patriots who had overthrown a tyrant. They had stood up to Craig Tolliver's machine and won, restoring what they believed was true justice to the county. They were the heroes of their own story, and they expected to be treated as such. But for the friends, allies, and business partners of the dead Democrats, the Martin clan was a mob of savage murderers from the hills. They saw the great gunfight not as a battle, but as a massacre, and they now lived in mortal fear of the men who had perpetrated it. This fear gave birth to a powerful conspiracy of silence. When the state authorities began their investigation, they were met with a wall of sealed lips and downcast eyes. Men who had witnessed the entire 2-hour battle from their shop windows suddenly claimed they had been hiding in their cellars and had seen nothing. Others, who surely knew the names of every man who marched on the town, would only shrug and say they couldn't recognize anyone through the smoke. To speak the truth was to choose a side, and in the shadow of such violence, choosing a side was a potential death sentence. Fear of Martin retribution was a more immediate threat than a distant state court. Yet, in this atmosphere of terror, small acts of courage and cowardice defined the true character of the people. A former Tolliver deputy who once walked with a confident swagger would now cross the street to avoid meeting the gaze of a Martin man. But a doctor who had been a friend of Tolliver's would still ride out to a Martin farm to tend to a sick child, his oath as a healer overriding the politics of hate. A widow of a slain Tolliver man might find a sack of flour left on her porch in the dead of night, a silent offering from a neighbor who dared not show support in the daylight. The war had moved from the streets into the hearts of the people, and every small decision, who to trade with, who to talk to, who to help, became a declaration of allegiance in a conflict that was far from over. The hunt for the killers of Craig Tolliver was not a chase with hounds and rifles through the dark hollows. The killers weren't hiding. They were walking the streets of Morehead in broad daylight, confident and victorious. The hunt that followed was a different kind of pursuit altogether, a methodical and dangerous game of wits waged by outsiders in a land that guarded its secrets jealously. The posse was not made of vengeful neighbors, but of state prosecutors and detectives from Frankfurt, city men who wore stiff collars and carried law books instead of Winchesters. Their prey was an entire faction, over 100 men bound by blood, politics, and the shared secret of the final gunfight. The mountains that had once hidden Tolliver's ambushes now served a new purpose. They hid the truth. The state's men rode from one isolated farm to the next, asking questions that were met with blank stares, convenient memory loss, and a steadfast, unnerving silence. The people of the hills, loyal to the Martins or simply terrified of them, created a fortress of ignorance. The investigators found themselves lost not in the woods, but in a fog of fear and clan loyalty. But the state had a power that Tolliver never did: the full weight of the law and the endless patience of bureaucracy. Slowly, painstakingly, they pieced together a list of names. Whispers were gathered, deals were offered, and cracks began to appear in the wall of silence. Finally, the state felt it had enough. Indictments were issued for the leaders of the Martin faction, charging them with murder and insurrection. The question that hung over the entire county was, would they come peacefully? Or would the state's lawmen have to fight a second war to bring them in? The moment of capture was not a bloody firefight, but a scene of quiet, surreal drama. Faced with warrants from the state, the very authority they claimed to respect, the Martin leaders made a calculated choice. One by one, they came down from their hill farms, met the lawmen, and surrendered their rifles. There was no resistance, no desperate last stand. They walked into custody with their heads held high, not as cornered fugitives, but as men who believed utterly in their own righteousness. They were confident that any jury of their peers would see them not as criminals, but as liberators who had done the county a necessary, if brutal, service. Their war was not over. It was simply moving from the battlefield to the courtroom. The courthouse in Morehead was not a hall of justice, it was a fortress. State militia, with bayonets fixed, stood guard at every entrance and lined the courtroom walls. The room was packed to suffocation, split down the middle as if by an invisible wall. On one side sat the grim-faced farmers and families of the Martin faction, their expressions hard and unyielding. On the other, the remaining allies of Craig Tolliver, their faces a mixture of grief, fear, and a desperate hope for vengeance. Every person in that room understood this was not just a trial. It was the final battle of the Rowan County War, fought not with rifles, but with words and law books. The prosecution, sent from the state capital, laid out a clear and brutal case. This was murder, plain and simple. A conspiracy of over 100 men who had taken the law into their own hands, sieged a town, and executed their political rivals in the street. They painted the Martin faction as a lawless mob, a threat to the very fabric of civilized society. But the defense lawyers, shrewd men who understood the ways of the mountains, told a different story. They portrayed Craig Tolliver as a ruthless tyrant who ruled Rowan County through fear and corruption. The Martin men, they argued, were not murderers. They were patriots, minutemen, who had risen up to liberate their community from a despot when the law itself had failed them. The trial became a spectacle of fear. One by one, witnesses were called to the stand. Men who had seen the whole bloody affair unfold would stare at the floor, their hands trembling, and mumble that they couldn't be sure of any faces they saw that day. The smoke, they'd say, was too thick. The chaos was too great. And you can imagine, my friends, the pressure in that room. You can imagine the silent, heavy gazes from the Martin supporters, a non-verbal promise of a long memory. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the killers in the hills now followed them right into the courthouse. Throughout the proceedings, the accused leaders of the Martin clan sat in their chairs with a quiet, unshakable dignity. There was no remorse in their eyes, no plea for mercy. They listened to the testimony with the stoicism of men who had made their peace with their actions long ago. They had done what they believed was necessary, and they put their faith not in clever lawyers, but in a jury of their peers, men who knew the land, who understood the grievances, and who had lived under the shadow of Craig Tolliver's rule. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The jury, 12 men from Rowan County, filed back into the silent, tense courtroom. They avoided the eyes of everyone, their faces pale and unreadable. The foreman stood, a single piece of paper trembling in his hand. He cleared his throat and spoke the words that would echo through those mountains for 100 years. On the charge of murder, on the charge of insurrection, the verdict for every single man was the same: not guilty. A roar erupted from one side of the room, a wave of triumphant relief. On the other side, there was only the dead silence of disbelief and defeat. The Martin men walked out of the courthouse as free men, acquitted by a jury of their neighbors. The law of the state had spoken, but was it justice? Or was it fear, wearing a judge's robes? The Martin men walked free from the courthouse, but the war had left a scar on every soul in Rowan County. For the allies of Craig Tolliver, the verdict was not just an acquittal, it was an eviction notice. Their leader was dead, their power was shattered, and the men who had killed him now held all the cards. There was no future for them in a county run by their mortal enemies. A quiet, grim exodus began. One by one, they sold their businesses and their land for whatever they could get, packed their families into wagons, and disappeared from the county, seeking a life in a place where their name was not a mark of defeat. For the victorious Martin faction, life after the verdict was not a simple return to peace. They had won the war, and in the following years, they took control of the courthouse and the sheriff's office, just as they had set out to do. But their victory was a heavy crown. They were no longer simple farmers. They were the men who had laid siege to a town and killed its leader. They were respected by their allies, but forever watched with fear by others. They had to live with the ghosts of what they had done, and the silence of their neighbors was a constant reminder of the blood that had been spilled. They had freed Rowan County from a tyrant, but in doing so had become figures of awe and terror themselves. The community, caught in the middle, made a silent pact to forget. It was a wound too deep to be discussed, a memory too painful to be preserved. The bullet holes in the storefronts were patched with new wood. The Galt House Hotel, the blood-soaked epicenter of the battle, stood empty and decaying for a time, a grim monument to the war, until it eventually burned to the ground, taking its ghosts and stories with it in the smoke. People stopped talking about the feud. A generation grew up knowing only a sanitized version of the story, or perhaps none at all. The great gunfight became the county's dark secret, a history that everyone knew, but no one dared to speak aloud. For the sake of peace, Rowan County buried its own past under a thick, heavy blanket of collective silence. If you walk the streets of Morehead, Kentucky today, you won't see the scars of a battlefield. You'll see the campus of a bustling university. You'll see traffic and commerce, a modern town moving at a modern pace. The old wooden storefronts are gone, replaced by brick and pavement. The thunder of the 1887 gunfight has been replaced by the everyday sounds of life. It would be easy to think that the Rowan County War was just a tall tale, a ghost story whispered by old men. But if you look in the local phone book, you will still find the names Martin and Tolliver. The descendants of the men who fought and died in that war still live on the same land, still walk the same streets. The blood has thinned, the old hatreds have cooled into a shared, complicated history. They are no longer armies, just families. A Martin and a Tolliver might work together. Their children might sit next to each other in school, most of them knowing little of the war their great-grandfathers waged for the soul of this very ground. The physical landmarks of the war are nearly all gone. The Galt House Hotel is a ghost, its location now just a spot on a modern street. But if you know where to look, you can find the final chapter. In the Old Town Cemetery, you can find the grave of Craig Tolliver. There is no grand monument to mark the resting place of the man who was once the untouchable king of Rowan County. There is only a stone, weathered by more than a century of Kentucky rain and sun, his name slowly being erased by time. It's a quiet, humble end for a man whose life was so loud and violent. People have tried to forget. For generations they buried the story, hoping silence would heal the wounds. But in Appalachia, the land has a memory longer than any person's. The mountains that surround Morehead stood as silent witnesses to the ambushes and the final bloody siege. The waters of Triplet Creek still flow as they did when they ran dark with rumor and fear. The buildings are gone, the guns are rust, and the men are dust, but the mountains remember everything. So we return to the question we asked at the very beginning around this digital campfire. Was this a feud, or was it a war? The story of Rowan County gives us a clear and chilling answer. This was not a petty squabble between families. It was the final bloody battle in a political war that had been simmering since the end of the Civil War. It's a brutal lesson in what happens when the law serves one man instead of all men, and when an entire community feels it has no recourse but the rifle. The great tragedy of the Rowan County War is that there were no simple heroes. To defeat a tyrant like Craig Tolliver, who had wrapped the law around himself like a shield, the Martin faction had to become a mirror of his own ruthlessness. They had to abandon that very law and become an army, delivering a verdict with a volley of lead because they believed a jury never would. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the line between a liberator and a killer can sometimes be as thin as a puff of gunsmoke. This is a story of the indomitable and sometimes terrifying Appalachian spirit. It is a testament to a code that says a man's honor is his own to defend, and that power taken by force can be taken away by force. It is a dark and violent chapter in our history, but one we must remember, for it reminds us that beneath the quiet surface of our towns and our histories, there are sometimes wars that have never truly ended. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story.